So, dudes, headbands on, I've got the fingerless gloves on. I'm suspecting this is going to be the most intense wrestling review that I've ever done. So, without further ado, I'm busting it out big with Wrestle War for the Sega Mega Drive. I should probably level with you guys now that I don't really enjoy wrestling that much. I don't know much about it. So this review was probably a bit of a stupid idea, but I'm going to push on anyway. First up, we've got Wrestle War for the Sega Mega Drive. This is a game that I played all the time as a younger bruiser and nearly killed my fingers with it. Let me just say that wrestling is goddamn crazy. The fighting part translates well enough into games, but how many wrestling games could really follow those insane storylines and that adult drama? The biggest issue I have with the early licensed wrestling games is that they all have these larger-than-life characters that are just kind of slugging each other rigidly in a square. I don't feel like the early systems could deliver the life that these personalities demanded, but Wrestle War is where it all started out for me. It's a super generic wrestling game, but for me, after all these years, it really highlights the appeal in the gameplay. When you strip away all that celebrity endorsements and all the spectacle and showmanship, what you're left with is a fighting game that's been mixed up with a beat 'em up. For most modern systems, wrestling games are still one of the best ways to get that beat 'em up vibe. I do find a lot of that showmanship a bit off-putting, especially now that I don't know any of the characters' names. But here on the Mega Drive, we get this really stripped-back experience, and if I had to name a favourite wrestling game just on the gameplay alone, this would probably be it for me. Playing single player, you have to play as the one character the entire time, but if you start up a two-player match, you can pick from different characters in the roster. There's a lot of grappling, there's not that many moves, and like I said, I nearly killed my fingers as a younger bruiser trying to beat this game. I never beat it, even with the automatic firing controllers. I just couldn't bash the buttons fast enough. So look, don't get me wrong, but Wrestle War is definitely not the best wrestling game on this list. I had a lot of fun with it, but the best reason for me to play a wrestling game outside that beat 'em up vibe really is the silliness. Now that's where WCW Nitro just went above and beyond for me personally. So I actually used to watch WCW. This was sort of my introduction to wrestling, and it's something that I used to do with my dad. We used to sit down and we used to watch WCW Nitro together. I could recognize these characters, so I was super stoked when my dad came home with the game. He never looked at it again, he never played it, but I can't really blame him either. This game is dull, it's rigid, and the graphics are a bit muddy. But in terms of silly video games, and I mean sillier than grown men punching each other while wearing tights, this game took it to the next level for me. The fighting itself is super rigid, but there's got a lot more moves than Wrestle War ever did. I was really excited coming into this game, and looking at it today, it's obviously an early PlayStation game. So the secret character roster is pretty massive, bizarre, and even mundane in some places. It's well worth poking around in here for yourself. A lot of the modern wrestling games cheap out with the whole create your own wrestler modes, but there's something satisfying about plugging in a cheat and unlocking an instant, bizarre, fully fleshed out roster, along with a few other wrestlers that weren't in that original lineup. And I really get a kick out of all the different rings available as well. I can't say they all look good, but after a few rounds with the regular roster, it was so much fun just fighting a Tyrannosaurus Rex in the jungle. And I'll admit that these secret characters are some of my fondest memories. The fighting itself feels a bit rigid, especially compared with how fluid the fighting feels in some of the later wrestling games. Coming from Wrestle War, it actually feels a bit more constricted with the movements, but the move list has been really padded out. The game in normal mode also feels unnaturally quick in the movements. You get used to it, but I do recommend playing in easy. And when you're burning through a few different wrestling games like I am for this review, the pace here does feel really out of whack. And, you know, this is the system that I came to after the Sega Mega Drive. This is what I was introduced to when it came to like 32-bit CD technology. One of my favorite parts was actually listening to the wrestlers rant at the start of the game. You couldn't do this on the Mega Drive, obviously, so it was really cool. And I know me and my brother, we both were able to recite the rants just word for word. Do you think you got what it takes to step into the ring? I think you're gonna wind up with a snap neck from the choke slam. And looking at it today, it's obviously an early PlayStation game, but for me, I feel like this era captures when I was most excited about wrestling. So this game's really resonated with me all these years later. If you were looking for a much more polished experience than WCW Nitro, you could always check out WCW nWO Revenge on the Nintendo 64, as well as WCW Mayhem on the PlayStation. Now, this game I played a lot with my brother, and I recently picked this one up because it was super cheap. But by this stage, we already kind of knew what to expect from wrestling games. They were starting to evolve and shift. WCW vs nWO Revenge is one of the last in the WCW series published by THQ for the Nintendo 64, and I was a little bit surprised to hear that this was considered by many to be the best wrestling game out there in 1998. I guess there must have been some reason to own a Nintendo 64, besides of course Pokemon Snap. But with 4 controllers, this is a really solid wrestling game, and I didn't have it as a kid, but I'm starting to wish I did. Coming from WCW Nitro, the official roster here has totally exploded, and there's still a handful more wrestlers to unlock, such as Rowdy Roddy Piper. The fighting itself is far more fluid and natural feeling. It doesn't feel quite so rigid and quick. So just for that, I feel like this game aged a lot better. And the fact we're dealing with a cartridge instead means that there's going to be no massive loading screens. If you do ever manage to find friends who play a video game from 17 years ago, a game like this on the 64 is easily one of the best looking wrestling games available for the system, and paired with some of the quickest loading times available on any home console, it keeps the action up and the adrenaline pumping. All I would have needed is 3 extra friends, but I graduated to WCW Mayhem.
Backbreaker! Oh my, that was a vicious move on Disco!
WCW Mayhem for the PlayStation 1, the first in the WCW series that wasn't published by THQ, but instead by Electronic Arts. In Mayhem, we can build our own wrestlers. There's just an insane roster of fighters and plenty of stages. So after WCW Nitro, which is the game I played a whole lot, I can't comment too much on WCW vs nWO, but this game feels a lot more like the modern wrestling games, where you can create your own characters. The graphics here feel more clean cut. Lots of spectacle, lots of showmanship. That's one thing I really like about the PlayStation games, by the way. The 64 just didn't have, obviously, the capacity for things like video, but the PlayStation games, they'll use it whenever they get the opportunity to. One kind of unique feature this game had was a pay-per-view option. On the show, WCW, I think on the Monday, they would announce a code, and you could put that into the game and watch the contestants battle it out in the game engine. It sounds dumb, and apparently it only lasted a few months, since the rosters in the game were already falling out of date by the time the game was released. So again, we have a really fluid wrestling game. There's plenty of animation in here, and things actually feel kind of natural in how people would actually move. One thing I really liked about WCW Mayhem coming from WCW Nitro was all the weapons you could have added in and the backstage areas. They really padded out that whole wrestling experience and just made it feel a bit more brutal in places. And the showmanship here was really ramped up to 11. We have things like the full motion video, but we also have the stage entrances that we got on the 64 version. So all up out of the WCW games, This one is going to be the one I'm most nostalgic about. It's the one I played the most, and it's also probably the most accomplished out of the bunch.
And what on earth is
Again, we are
going to do
dealing
now?
with the longer loading times, however.
What a move off the turnbuckle!
And as far as wrestling games go, this is where I'm going to have to wrap it up. I never watched the WWF or later the WWE. It just wasn't the wrestling that I watched with my dad. I really feel like these sort of games, you get stuck in an era. These are the characters that you remember the best. These are the ones that you grew up watching, and these are the ones that you have the best memories associated with them. So when it came to move on from the WCW Nitro, I guess I never did. There was one game after WCW Mayhem, WCW Backstage Assault, and I very nearly picked it up, but look, the reviews weren't great. It wasn't that different, and WCW Mayhem already had like a way to get into the backstage areas, and so yeah, I wasn't that compelled to pick the game
How
up.
much more can he take? They floored him with that weapon.
Last one out of the building can turn out the lights, because this one is...
The graphics, the gameplay, the features, they keep piling up in the wrestling games, but if you can't pick your favorite characters and you don't really care about the spectacle here, then going forward the appeal just wasn't there for me.
That will end the match.
That looked like it really hurt. Oh, he's got
And in saying that, I thought I'd take the opportunity to wind down with something a little bit different. No disrespect to you wrestling fans, but I may never get another opportunity to bust out the Simpsons Wrestling game for the PlayStation 1. This is a game I totally got my friends' parents to rent because, you know, it's a Simpsons game and it's got wrestling in it. And to me as a kid, that was such a cool concept. You could nearly imagine what each of the characters' special moves could have been. The kinds of power-ups, the kinds of stages and the obstacles, but man, that kid wasn't my friend for much longer afterwards. So, the Simpsons game is an underhanded cash grab, which is why I don't have the original version. I play it on my Android tablet, on the train, all alone, but true enough, I do still play it. It's a quick, easy Simpsons game. Bright colours, good handful of characters, and it's got a really polished Simpsons production value feel. The Simpsons games might always be a bit hit and miss in the gameplay portion, but they usually tend to look pretty good. It's not a game I'd recommend, but it is something I'd play, and it's actually the only Simpsons game released across the PlayStation 1, the 64, the Saturn, the whole 32-bit era. Hard to think this is the one idea they kinda just ran with. So, to play us out, I thought I'd check out one of my favourite systems, the Neo Geo. Well, you know, this is the Neo Geo X, but it's still a system that I do play, and I do really enjoy 3 Count Bout. So yeah, like I said, really love the Neo Geo arcade games. It felt like it was a system that was still doing retro 2D style arcade gameplay after it was cool. A little bit like me reviewing retro video games way longer than I should have. But 3 Count Bout is one of the more popular wrestling games straight out of SNK. Although it wasn't all that well received, I think it looks freaking awesome. And look, going back to talking about what made Wrestle War feel so awesome to me, it's essentially built like a classic beat 'em up. 3 Count Bout came preloaded with the Neo Geo X. It's not going to be for everyone, but I felt like it was a great way to wind down and, you know, really come full circle. If I had 3 Count Bout as a younger bruiser, there is no doubt that this game would have easily been my favourite. But guys, thank you so much for coming this far. If you're actually after a good reviewer who can review a wrestling game, I totally recommend checking out both Pat the NES Punk and Cygnus Destroyer. I've really enjoyed both of their wrestling reviews, and that kind of prompted me to do one of my own wrestling reviews covering the games that I remember best, not particularly the NES games. Or alternatively, I've also done a review on the Jaguar fighting games. A really stellar bunch of titles there, well worth checking out if you're a fan of beating people up. So thank you guys so much for watching, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you next time right here on the Leftover Culture Review. Cheers guys.
The Leftover Culture Review.